Okay, so today we are going to be doing the prologue of Beowulf. So if you read it, that's fantastic. If you didn't, we're going to be going through it and really looking for different literary elements and also some different, seeing how the literature and the way that they're describing and using words teaches us about the culture. Really, the prologue of Beowulf really sets the setting for the rest of the piece. So let's get started with some vocabulary here. Does anyone know what an epic poem is and would mind explaining to us? What is an epic poem? I still have 4 slots for panelists, so if there's anyone who's not a panelist and wants to be made one, let me know because I still have 4 slots. So. Okay, so an epic poem is just, it's a long narrative that has a series of different characters. They have different positions of importance, but as usual, with the usual story, you have all these adventures with a central heroic figure. And these adventures are really important because it's more than just a story about one person or maybe one person's life or even one achievement. It's very important to the history of a nation or a nation of a race. And in this case, what would be the nation or the race specifically that Beowulf is about? Does anyone remember? Yeah, Justin.
The Geats, I'm pretty sure.
Right. And they're going to go over to Denmark, right? So you've got Denmark, you kind of have that whole northern region there. And this is specifically an Anglo-Saxon piece as well, so all of the Anglo-Saxon culture. Which goes into the next vocabulary word. So we have Anglo-Saxon verse. It's the oldest metrical system in English poetry. And we're going to see a lot of different aspects of Anglo-Saxon accents and language in the form of the verse form of Beowulf. Okay. Alliteration. Does anyone remember? We talked a little bit about alliteration. Yeah, James, go ahead.
Yeah, it's where, like, certain letters repeat in certain words or in, like, a sentence a lot of times. It makes it, like, silly something, like, like, all starting with a S or a T in a sentence.
Right. Or, like, Peter picked a peck of pickled peppers, right? Or, like, here Jacob has an example. Sally has sticky, slippery squid slices, right? So that's alliteration.
Yeah, but tongue twisters are a good example of that.
Yeah, it's a very good example. Perfect. So exactly. So James is exactly right. That is alliteration. And alliteration is something that you're going to see in Anglo-Saxon verse and in Beowulf. Okay, so Beowulf is written in a language that is a little difficult to understand since it's written in the Anglo-Saxon verse. So, of course, we're going to have an interpretation to help us to be able to better understand it, better understand its meaning. And we have a video here. Well, we're actually going to do a video where we're going to hear the part of Beowulf in the Old English language. But before we do that, let's go into some literary characters. So first we're gonna do the vegetables before we get to the fun dessert part. Yeah, Shri has a question. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Shri. The mic would be great.
Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. My question was, the Anglo-Saxon was also a language. I remember in history it was also a tribe.
Yes. So the Anglo-Saxons it was a combination of the Angles and the Saxons. So they were the Germanic people. This is before the time of the Norman Conquest, which is 1066, William the Conqueror. If you remember in Robin Hood, those different stories, you've got Prince John and King Richard. Those were all Normans over the Saxons. So if you remember, so this is before that time period, before all those Normans came over. And so the Anglo-Saxons, they're the ones who really ruled Great Britain from the 5th century all the way up till the Norman conquest. And the Anglo-Saxons, they're a fascinating people because, well, actually, let me see if I can find the statement really quick. This is a statement from Erastus Snow where he talks about, we've talked about this before, but the Anglo-Saxon people many of them were Israelites. Israelite Ephraim, Judah, Dan, Gad, Asher, all those tribes that got spread throughout, and they forgot their identity. They forgot who they were. A lot of them went up to Great Britain and became what we know as Anglo-Saxon tribes. And you see that in their government. They had a government that was like the Constitution. They had a government that was like Moses' government in the scriptures. In fact, John Adams said that we should trace part of the Constitution. They looked back to Hengist and Horsa, who were the Saxon chiefs. And this is a statement from Erastus Snow, and I don't have it. Let me see if I can put it up on the screen here, maybe in a Word doc or something here, so that you can see it. Sorry, this is impromptu, so I don't have it in a slide here. And this is Erastus Snow. So he's a church leader during the early days of the church. It says, now the same spirit of revelation that sought out the prophet Joseph Smith from the loins of Joseph that was sold into Egypt. So you remember, Joseph Smith was a descendant of Joseph of Egypt. So he's saying that same spirit that called Joseph Smith, the Lord's Spirit, of course, has also called the children of Abraham from among the kingdoms and countries of the earth to first hear and then embrace the everlasting gospel. So this is something that's really important. Joseph Fielding Smith talked about this. Most of the presidents of the church have talked about how every one of you in this class today are literally Israel. You are Israelites. You're just as much Israelites as when you read the Old Testament and it's talking about the children of Israel. That's you guys. You are those descendants. So Erastus Snow said there's the spirit from the Lord that's going throughout the world to gather the children of Abraham. And the remnants of the seed of Ephraim who were scattered from Palestine and who colonized the shores of the Caspian Sea and then made their way into the north of Europe. So they went all over the world. They went to Asia, they went to Russia, they went to Africa, they went to South America, they went to North America, they went to all over the world. But most of them, the purest blood, went up to Northern Europe, Western Scandinavia, and Northern Germany, penetrating Scotland and England and conquering those nations and reigning as monarchs of Great Britain, mingling their seed with the Anglo-Saxon race. So right here we have a church leader talking about how the Anglo-Saxons, they're mixed in blood of Israel. So when we're reading Beowulf, that's kind of a connection to think, wow, these are our cousins. These are our brothers and sisters. And for a lot of us, the Anglo-Saxons are our ancestors. Spreading over the waters a fruitful vine, as predicted by Jacob. He's talking about Genesis 49 there, whose branches should run over the wall. Their blood has permeated European society, and it coursed in the veins of the early colonists of America. John Adams, George Washington, they're all Israelites. And when the book shall be opened, and the lineage of all men known, it will be found that they have been first and foremost in everything noble among men and in various nations, and breaking off the shackles of kingcraft and priestcraft. So what he's talking about here, and we'll stop here and maybe I'll put the whole quote in the slide so you can read the whole thing, but he's talking about how it's Israel that goes throughout the world and brings freedom. So when you look at the Revolutionary War, you look at different movements of freedom, like for instance when communism moved into Hungary and you have the Hungarian freedom fighters who are fighting for freedom, those were Israelites. The Polish freedom fighters, those were Israelites. The different people in Russia who were still fighting for freedom, the Christians over there, that's Israelite blood. It's that Israelite blood that fights for freedom, that fights off oppression and kingcraft and priestcraft. Okay, so that is, but back to the point for this lesson, we have these Anglo-Saxons. These Anglo-Saxons are Israelites. And what we're going to see today, and this is something that will be kind of interesting as we're going through the prologue, we're going to see elements of Israelite behavior in Beowulf that slightly got corrupted, because these Anglo-Saxons didn't know they were Israelites, right? They don't know that. They've forgotten who they were. That's why we call them the lost 10 tribes of Israel. They don't know who they are. But they still have that blood, so they have this behavior. Sometimes they forget, and sometimes it gets a little corrupted, and we're going to see some of that. Now, before we go back into Beowulf, we have to, like I said, cover a couple of the vegetables before we can get to the dessert, and talk about some different literary terms. Most of these, I think you probably already know. Metaphor. What's metaphor?
Like comparing something without using like or as.
Right, right. So the example we have here on the screen is all the world is a stage, right? The world isn't really a stage. I think we all know that. But it's a metaphor. Now, what's the difference between a metaphor and a simile? So simile is also a literary form that's comparing two things, but it does it in a different way. Right, so like Shree said, they use like or as. His voice was as smooth as silk. He was as strong as a lion. So it's clear they're not saying his voice was silk. They're saying his voice was smooth as silk. So it clarifies that they're two different things, a little bit stronger. Personification. What's personification?
It gives human quality to something.
Good, Shree. So like the example we have here, the sea is angry. Anyone think of another example of personification, or maybe make up one? Okay, good. Like she said, the box was jumpy. Okay, the box is not really, right, the box doesn't really have that, right. The rock was a stubborn fellow, right? So that's a really good example, Jacob, very good. So it's you're putting a human quality onto an animal or any other, not like a rock or a box or a picture or a car, anything, putting human qualities on that to try to describe or make it seem to come alive. Okay, like Maria said, the sky is crying, right? That's another one. I think, Connor, or Aubrey, that would probably be more of a simile. The apple was as red as blood. That would be closer to, but definitely it is using the idea of a personification where you're taking something that's human or and putting that on something that's clearly not. Okay, what's a hyperbole? I think all of us probably have used hyperboles before in our life. Sometimes they're not the funnest.
Extreme exaggeration.
Extreme exaggeration, right? Okay, I think we can all think of one. One that I hear a lot is, you do this every time, right? Or like is the example, I've told you a million times. Maybe they didn't really say it a million times. That's a little exaggerated, but they're trying to make a point. They're making a claim that's not literally true, but it's trying to make a point. What, does anyone have? Okay, Shree has one. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Hopefully we wouldn't take that literally, but it gets the point across. She's pretty hungry. Yeah, like James, I will kill you if you don't play with me, right? Or this pain is gonna, like, I'm gonna die here, right? Okay, so good examples, good examples. Okay, let's move to just two more literary things, and then we're gonna jump into Beowulf here. So, alliteration. So alliteration is an understatement used for emphasis by stating a negative rather than a positive. So, she's not bad looking or something like that. And what you're really communicating is something that's more negative, but you're saying some, like just the words, she's not bad looking, maybe would mean, oh yeah, she looks good, but when you're using it as a litote, you're using it to emphasize something negative. Does anyone have any other examples of a litote they can think of? We'll get into these more as we're going through Beowulf here. So a kenning here. So we have two words used in place of one, and they're often hyphenated. So we're going to see this a lot in the prologue for Beowulf. So the example, the word for sword might be replaced with the wound hoe, or the sea might become the swan road. The king is called the ring giver. Two words, different words, they're put together, hyphenated, and they use that hyphenated word to replace words for things, everyday things. Okay. Okay, so let's get started. So Anglo-Saxon verse has 4 principal beats with any number of syllables. So it doesn't rhyme. Rhyme came later with the more Latin culture and coming from Rome. But when the gleeman would chant these Anglo-Saxon poems, he would usually, they'd have a chord on the harp or maybe another instrument, and they would accent each of the important accented syllables. So what we're going to do is I'm going to send this video through the chat box, and then maybe in about, you can listen to it. We'll do maybe 1.5, 2 minutes, and then we'll come back. So let me just send this. Can you get the link? Okay, so here's the link here. We'll come back at about 2:24, 2:25. We'll get started again at 2:25. So you have a couple minutes to take a look at that video. Okay, everybody, we'll go ahead and come back here. Okay, yes, Sri, I think we both probably felt the same. That's why we're not going to read Beowulf in the Anglo-Saxon tongue, which is okay. That's all good. But so what did the poem sound like to you? I've seen a couple comments through the chat box, but if someone can make some verbal comments, what did the poem sound like? What did that language sound like?
Old English or something Norse or no, not Norse, more just I forgot everything we were talking about.
Definitely. Yeah, go ahead, Sri.
It sounded kind of like Latin or Irish or something. Very, very close to Irish.
Mm-hmm. So I noticed it has the same accent and the same style of speaking that you really see in the Scottish Highlands, or like you're saying, in kind of an Irish flair to it. So did you hear the rhythm? And when you heard that rhythm, could you imagine in your mind a musical instrument, strumming along a musical instrument with it? Anyone have a comment they'd want to make over the microphone about that?
I play guitar to that rhythm occasionally.
Oh yeah, there you go. So what do you think the purpose of Anglo-Saxon verse? What would you imagine, just from the style that it's written and the use of its rhythm, what would you imagine it was primarily used for in Anglo-Saxon culture? Some plays. What are some other settings, kind of in that old time, that you can imagine that they would be using? Their verse is written in a style that could be played with a musical instrument that has a rhythm to it. You can think of like the taverns. What we're going to see in Beowulf is they have the great hall where you have the king, and he'd have his different balladeers and people. Verse and poetry and music really had a central role in a lot of these cultures. A lot of their history was told through what you could call through, maybe not music, but a musical style of the verse. Okay, so let's talk about the setting for Beowulf. So the setting for the first part of the poem, it takes place in Hro. That's the name for the male deer, or the stag animal of prey, the one that they would hunt by men or other animals. So this name is more than just a name. It's a foreshadowing. Does anyone know what a foreshadowing is? Right. So it's like a prophecy. It's something, it's an element of something, it's an event, or it's, in this case, a name, or something that happens, or a certain identifier or something that is a prophecy, like Shri is saying. It's something that's going to happen on later. So you have, it's the name for the male deer, the stag animal that's hunted, and it's a foreshadowing for the plot of the poem. And that's the name for the place where all place for the guests. It was called the mead hall. Why? How do you think? What would you guess? We haven't read the story yet, but how would you guess that that name is a foreshadowing for the poem? What do you think is going to happen in this poem based off of the foreshadowing of using that name, the hero or Hera? Andrew, do you have a comment? Okay, just wanted to check. Anyone want to throw out any guesses? There isn't necessarily a right answer. Great. Sri, do you mind making your comment over the mic? Is that okay?
Yeah. As I just typed, Beowulf is the hero. He will be hunted or hunt.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of get the feeling that the rest of the story is going to have this kind of an element of a hunt, right?
Yeah.
So this hall had a central place in Anglo-Saxon society. It's the Great Hall where all of the Lord's warriors would feast. They'd listen to the stories. They'd sleep there. And this hall is where Beowulf and his men first go at the beginning of the story for a formal audience with the Danish king. But the poem first starts with a family history of all the main characters. So Beowulf is written in third person, or it's told by a narrator who sees everything, past, present, future. It's told from that perspective. And if you remember, it was written hundreds of years after the events actually occurred. So the narrator opens the poem with a discussion about Shield Chieftain. He was the first of the great kings of ancient days and the founder of their royal line. And he comes from humble beginnings. He rises to great power, and we're going to read about this. This is just kind of an overview so that you kind of have a feel for what's going on before we jump in. Shield has a son who accomplishes these great deeds. Ultimately, he wins the loyalty of his fellow men through his generosity, and when he dies, he is laid to rest in a ship filled with treasures, and he's set out to sea. And the narrator tells us that this is the same way his life really began. Now, here we're going to see another aspect of Israelite culture. So the whole story, so you might think, well, let's jump into the action, right? Let's jump into the story of Beowulf. But the story instead starts with the genealogy of the kings. And this is really important because genealogy is something that is always important to anyone of Israel blood. Even though Israelites, sometimes they'll forget who they are, like the Anglo-Saxons, you'll always notice that certain cultures really value their history. They write it down, they treasure it, that it's very important to them, and those cultures are generally the ones you can trace back to Israelite beginnings. So you see that with the Anglo-Saxon culture. Their genealogy is very important. Do we see any examples of where genealogy is important in the scriptures? Can you think of any times in the scriptures where you can tell, oh, this person, their genealogy is really important to them, or the genealogy is emphasized? Good example, Connor, Nephi. Would you mind maybe elaborating over the mic a little bit about how Nephi is a good example of this?
It's Aubrey, by the way.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry.
I said Nephi because I know when I'm reading the scriptures, I can't think of a particular story, but I know that he writes down a lot what happens, and usually in great detail, and he tells a lot of him studying, and it's really great principles that you learn from him by his genealogy.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating because Nephi, of course, is, if we're talking about first Nephi, that's the first, really the first, I mean, technically Lehi is the first prophet, but Nephi is really kind of the first patriarch or the whole Nephite race. And it's interesting because if you think about this, recognize this next time you're reading the book through the Book of Mormon, all over in the Book of Alma, Book of Helaman, you have different prophets come up, and they'll introduce themselves by saying, I'm a descendant of Nephi. So when Alma the Younger gets up, Alma the Elder, he gets up and he starts, I'm a descendant of Nephi. Or in the Book of Helaman, he starts, I'm a descendant of Nephi, and this is my mission. That was important to them. It was more than just oh, by the way, let me give you my history, kind of like we might give our address or our social security number. It's more than that. It was something important to them. You think about the beginning of Matthew, the whole first page of the whole Gospel of Matthew. Does anyone know what the first however number of verses is dedicated to in the Book of Matthew?
Jesus' birth and stuff, and how he was crucified and everything.
Right. And do you remember how Matthew opened that story? So of course that's one of the most important stories, right? In the scriptures, here's Christ. And how does the story begin? Matthew chapter 1. Feel free if anybody wants to cheat and look. You can look. It's on LDS.org. I don't want to just give it away, so if someone might want to look it up, then you can discover the epiphany moment for yourself. We'll keep going here, and then if somebody finds it, then they can jump in. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, basically. First several verses of Matthew. How does the whole gospel open up?
There are 16 verses.
And Tree, what's in those 16 verses? That's a lot of verses, right?
There's a whole bunch of he begat, and she begat.
That's the genealogy line. So the whole New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, before they even start Christ's story, you can see the apostles really felt it was important. Christ's genealogy was important. Enough that they spent 16 verses listening the whole thing out. And sometimes we could just skip over that thinking like, okay, boring, move on, right? And without thinking, wait a minute, what are they trying to communicate? Why did they feel it was so important to write it down? It's because that was the genealogy showing came from Adam. They were proud of their forefathers. They were proud of their ancestors because their ancestors were ancestors who had made covenants. Their ancestors were the first freedom fighters, the first ones who really were the prophets. And so they were proud of that ancestry, and they felt a connection with that ancestry. And that's really a characteristic of Israel. You could tell when someone's of more has a lot of Israelite blood in them by how much they care about their ancestry. Okay, so Beowulf begins, the prologue. Hear me. We've heard of Danish heroes, ancient kings, and the glory they cut for themselves, swinging mighty swords, how Shield made slaves of soldiers from every land, crowds of captives he beat. So we already talked a little bit about who Shield is. What do you think it means when it says Shield made slaves of soldiers from every land? What are they saying there? How could Shield make slaves of soldiers? Good. So there's not a specific answer. So I like all the different thoughts I'm seeing come through. Aubrey says he made them bow to him, just like Satan. So kind of the idea of he took away that dignity, that agency, that individualism in different men that he conquered and made them bow before him, humiliated them. Like Shri said, he's not paying them. They've gone from just being soldiers to complete slaves, working them over hard, right, making them work. So you can think, it says, Shield made slaves of soldiers from every land, crowds of captives he'd beaten. So this is definitely a conquering king, right? This is a king who goes into countries and he takes captives and he takes men that may have been great warriors and he completely reverses their situation, right? Takes them from being great maybe leaders in society, great respected soldiers, and humiliates them into captive slaves. So Shield says, into terror he traveled to Denmark alone, an abandoned child, but he changed his own fate. He lived to be rich and much honored. So what do we know about Shield so far? What do we know about Shield? Who he was, where he came from? I like what Jen said. He really breaks down back to the soldiers and captives sentence in the previous slide, right? He's breaking them down. Good. So what do we know about who Shield was from this first part? Okay, right. So like Aubrey said, he was scared, he was weak, but what happened to him? How did he get to the point where he's this amazing, mighty king? I'd agree. Sure, he's probably not the most amazing hero to look up to. Right, so Shield's this king who started from humble beginnings. He's abandoned. Probably he was an orphan. He comes to Denmark by himself, but he changes his own fate. Like Aubrey said, he changed his fate, and he elevated himself to gain possessions, to gain honor, and he ruled lands on all sides. Wherever the sea would take them, his soldiers sailed and returned with tribute and obedience. Then they say, there was a brave king, and he gave them more than his glory, conceived a son for the Danes, a new leader, allowed them by the grace of God. They had lived before his coming, kingless and miserable. So what did Shield give the Danes that maybe it sounds like they didn't have before? Yeah, Justin, did you have a comment? Okay. What does Shield do to the kingdom of the Danes? How does he change Denmark? Let's look at, so this is specifically in the second paragraph there. Okay, good. So like Shree says, before there wasn't a lot of order, right? So let's look here and let's do some, what was it like before and what was it like after Shield comes? So what was it like before? What do we learn from these two paragraphs? What was the country like before Shield rises to power? Mostly in the very last line. Okay, good. Like Megan said, miserable. What's the other attribute that we learned in the last line, right before miserable? Kingless, right? So what does this tell us about the culture of Denmark? What are they trying to see? What does that mean when they say they're kingless and miserable? What's kind of the picture they're trying to paint here for us? No one to follow. Good, Jen. So there's no order. There's no monarchy. They don't have a leader, right? So, and we could talk a lot about, okay, well then how are they miserable? Is maybe their economic system failing? If they don't have order, is it kind of every man for himself? What is this? Is it anarchy? What's the situation like? But let's go to what is it like after he comes? Of course, from the perspective of the Danes. So I've already seen, so like some of the comments said, some hope, if you can call it hope, probably wasn't very hopeful for the nations he conquered. But for the Danes, they saw as glory, that he gives them a son, someone who can follow in his footsteps, a prince, a new leader, bravery. They kind of rise to power. Yeah, Justin, go ahead.
Well, I suppose what he gives them is like a leader, someone to be in charge. Like, I guess he's not exactly one of the, like, he's good. If to conquer the lands, he had to be brave and and strong and powerful to do so.
Hmm.
So I suppose he's kind of a good leader, though he does have his downsides probably. So just someone to lead them, to be their ruler.
Good. Hmm. Right. Very good. So the next he says, now the Lord of all life, ruler of glory, blessed them with a prince, Beowulf, whose power and fame soon spread throughout the world, right? So Shield's son, the prince, he follows in his father's footsteps. He's the strong son, was the glory of Denmark. His father's warriors were wound round his heart. Okay, so here is a literary style. Does anyone know of the kind of the literary styles we talked about before? So we've got metaphor, simile, metaphor or simile, which one would this be? His father's warriors were wound round his heart. Metaphor, right? The warriors, they're not really wound round his heart, right? Or at least we hope not, right? That would be, I think, a little unrealistic. So we could see, okay, this is a metaphor. What is the author trying to say? What is this metaphor communicating? Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
This is a guess. I'm not
Mhm.
I'm just guessing. Like that he likes to. Well, he's a warrior, or that he's just been around war, so he likes to fight. I guess
Yeah.
is that
Well,
is that accurate? Or not?
Yeah, well, see, the amazing thing about literature is, and metaphor is its symbolism, right? So every one of us can see it just a little bit differently, then we pull it all together. It's painting this picture. So like you're saying, so he's definitely a strong warrior, right? How do you think that connects with his father's warriors? So you've got this prince, and he's strong, he has power and fame, it's spreading throughout the world. How do you think this goes over with his father's warriors? So his father's warriors like it, or is there a connection there? Yeah.
Well, yeah. I suppose it's a little. I suppose he kind of like well, way of saying it. I lost my wording.
Yeah. No worries. No worries. Has anyone ever heard the phrase when they say, and you see it a lot used when maybe a new baby is born and they go, wow, she's got her dad wrapped around her little finger, or something like that. Have you heard that kind of a phrase? The idea is that little baby has that dad's emotion, or that mom or the sister or brother, whoever it is. Pretty much that baby, they love that baby so much, that baby kind of is leading them, and they've got that tied around their little heartstrings. So I think that's a similar concept here. So you have these father's warriors, and they're just wound around his heart. It's this idea of there's a strong emotional connection. There's a strong connection of course, they're fighting together. And yeah, go ahead, Justin.
So in other words, like they trust him and they'll follow him,
Yeah.
and they kind of accept him as like their second leader, or
Yeah.
something.
Right. Think about what happens when two people fight in a war together. Maybe it's a physical war, maybe it's an ideological war, maybe it's on a project. Think about if you've ever, have any of you ever worked with another person on a project? More than just a project, it was a project or a cause that you really cared about. It was something that you were trying to move forward. Yeah, Justin.
Like when you were saying, have any of you ever worked on that stuff? I was kind of going to maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Like, yeah, I've done it before, but.
Did any of you ever feel any kind of connection with that person that maybe was different than somebody you just knew, that was, or a stronger friendship after working together on that cause? Anyone kind of know that kind of a feeling? A little bit like Aubrey said, they have each other's backs. You can think of two soldiers if they're fighting together, two buddies in a war. There's a strong commitment to each other that might be different than if they were just friends on the home front, right? Also, let's see who made the comment. It's a good comment. Shri, she said, I kind of think of the word fear. So you have a respectful fear. You also have a kind of scared fear, right? They know that this prince means business. He's a strong warrior. So you can see both aspects. You can see maybe a more negative. You can see maybe a more positive. So we're seeing this aspect of the Anglo-Saxon culture. They're definitely a warlike people, right? They're definitely, the battles mean everything. It's if a person is, you've got the first king shield. He's amazing. He's the hero because he's out there conquering people and destroying civilizations. This is a quote from President Kimball, which is important for us to think, okay, is this good? Is this bad? Is it maybe something in between? What is the right perspective on how we should view this? This is President Kimball. He said, we, and he's talking to us Latter-day Saints. He's talking to us Israel. This is a characteristic of Israel. He says, Israel is a warlike people. We're fighters. We're definitely fighters. He said, but we get easily distracted from our assignment of preparing for the coming of the Lord. When enemies rise up, we commit vast resources to the fabrication of gods of stone and steel, ships, planes, missiles, fortifications. You can think about, he's describing our day, but you can see some connections with the Anglo-Saxon that we've just been reading in Beowulf as well. He says, we depend on them for protection and deliverance. When threatened, we become anti-enemy instead of pro-kingdom of God. We train a man in the art of war and call him a patriot, and thus, in the manner of Satan's counterfeit of true patriotism, perverting the Savior's teaching. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. Now, is President Kimball saying that defending your home and families is wrong? Is that what he's saying? What's President Kimball trying to teach here? No, good, right? He's not saying that if you're a person that's able to defend your families, that's bad. What's President Kimball trying to say here? James, did you have a comment? Good. So like Shri said, she goes, don't go looking for a fight, right? That's what he's trying to say. He's trying to say we're a people that we like to be involved in causes and be out there. We have this warrior spirit, but he says we have to be careful so we don't get distracted and we don't fight because we want to fight or somebody is our enemy, so we become anti-enemy. Like he says, we don't want to become anti-enemy. We're supposed to be pro-kingdom of God. What would be a good example in the scriptures of somebody who was not anti-enemy, he was pro-kingdom of God? A warrior who was a fighter, who wasn't fighting his enemies, he was fighting for the kingdom of God. Good. Captain Moroni, right? And I'm actually going to close out by that because we're running out of time here. But we'll finish. You can read the rest of the play. The prologue, and well, actually, I'm going to let's jump ahead because I do want to cover one other part of this prologue here really quick. So when the prologue is finished, and then we'll come back to Captain Moroni and Captain Helaman. Don't worry, we'll come back. So the play kind of is finishing out. It says, Shield's reign had been long, he ruled them well, and he says, there they brought, so this is when he's died, and they're putting him in the boat, and they're going to send him back to sea. They're going to return him, and it talks about in the prologue about how they're sending him back. He came from the sea, they're sending him back to the sea. It says, of the ring-giving Lord. So here's ring-giving, that's a kenning, it's that form of the literary where they're merging the two words, putting them together with a hyphen, and they're using that word. Just a really quick question. What do you think? Why do they call him a ring-giving lord? Does anyone know what kind of imagery does that perspective? Does anyone know the importance of a ring and kings and authority and tying those together? Okay, so Shree's seeing some possible connections with he's having authority over marriage licenses. Connor, excellent. That is exactly what I was thinking of as well. Is your mic working? And if it is, do you mind making your comment about Joseph in Egypt over the mic, where you see the connection with the ring?
That was actually Aubrey.
Okay. Aubrey, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just thinking of when after Joseph went through all the trials and he finally, was put at the king's side, the king gave him the ring, so, that you rule over this. It was kind of, a symbolism of trust and, friendship.
Right. And authority, right? And that's why I wanted to just jump into this, because if you see, when you go through the scriptures again, there's several parables in the New Testament and elements in the Old Testament as well. When a king gives the ring, he's giving that authority. He's kind of, and if you remember the story of Joseph in Egypt, the Pharaoh was still the king. He was the ultimate king, but Joseph of Egypt was king in every way except for the throne. So it was a position of high power and authority. So anyways, I just wanted to do that. Okay, let's go back to really quick. We'll finish out here, Alma 48. So we have these kings that are definitely Israelite kings. They're warrior kings, these Anglo-Saxon warrior kings, and they have their perspective on war and on battle and on conquering. But in the Book of Mormon, and from President Kimball, when we read that quote earlier, what is the correct? How should we truly view war? Truly view defending freedom? Truly view what is the correct place for warfare? Alma 48. Let's read this really quick. So Alma 48. Now the Nephites were taught to defend themselves against their enemies, even to the shedding of blood, if it were necessary. If it were necessary. Yea, and they were also taught never to give an offense. Yea, never to raise the sword, except it were against an enemy, except it were to preserve their lives. Joseph Smith was the one who said, every man has the right to defend his family and his property, and no one can take that away. So that is a God-given right. Like, you have the right to life. You have the right to defend yourself and to defend your family. Alma 48 continues. This was their faith. This was their faith. This was their part of their religion. Do a lot of us think of it that way? Do a lot of us think, oh, when someone says, what do you believe? Oh, I believe the articles of faith. I believe in God. I believe the Book of Mormon is true. I believe Joseph Smith was a prophet. Well, part of our faith is this principle. It was part of the Nephite faith. It was part of the Christian faith. That's why in the Book of Mormon they call it the cause of Christians. It was Malachi who was like, those Christians, I hate those Christians. It's their Christian cause that's teaching them to defend freedom. It was part of their Christian faith. So this was their faith, that by so doing, God would prosper them in the land. It talks about how they had to keep the commandments. Yea, God would warn them to flee or to prepare for war according to their danger. So sometimes the Lord would tell you, okay, you need to flee. Sometimes he would tell them, you need to prepare for war. But the key was they did what God asked them to do. That this was the faith of Moroni. This was his religion. His heart did glory in it, not in the shedding of blood, but in doing good, by preserving his people, yea, and keeping the commandments of God, yea, and resisting iniquity. And then Mormon finishes out here. He says, verily, verily, I say unto you, if all men had been, and were, and ever would be like unto Moroni, men would have this attitude towards freedom. If men had this attitude of being warriors for Christ, what would happen? The very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. The devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. So every one of us, we started out by talking about how every one of us is Israel. Every one of you young men in this class, every one of you young ladies, You have Israelite blood in you. You have a God-ordained responsibility to be a warrior for Christ, but you have to be the right kind of warrior, because if you become a warrior like Shield was, you're not going to shake the powers of hell. But if you become a warrior like Captain Moroni was, you leave a mark on the world that can completely change the world for good. Okay. Can I get a volunteer for a closing prayer? Come on, after we have that lesson, can I have a warrior in this class brave enough to give the closing prayer? First step. Prayer is the first tool for battle. Perfect. Thank you, Ryan.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful that we're able to listen to the class today, and we're thankful to listen about the book Beowulf, and we'll be able to understand the meanings in it, and we'll be able to have help on any of the quizzes or tests that we'll take today. And in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate it.